Let's take a look at a debate between Noam Chomsky and William F. Buckley Jr. that took place in 1969. The main subject of the debate is the Vietnamese War. Chomsky thinks the war should come to an end, while Buckley has some reservations. The debate is very fast-paced, but Chomsky manages to roughly sketch his position.
At which point did an intellectual argument in favor of our intervening in Vietnam cease to exist?
Well, as I say there, I think that there may have been a time when there was something to debate. For example, I think that in the middle 50s, though I was opposed to the policy, and I think that it was right to be opposed to it, nevertheless, I think it was a debatable issue in a sense in which it is no longer a debatable issue.
Why is that?
Because at the moment, I think it's really an issue of the survival of the existence of Vietnam as an entity, as a social and cultural entity. I think that's what's at stake.
The go-to counterexample for Buckley throughout the debate will be Nazi Germany.
The existence of the society as a social and cultural entity, I think that's what's at stake.
Oh, okay, well, what, if it's at stake, mightn't there be two points of view about how to help it evolve into its natural forms, right?
Oh, there are many different points of view. I think they're very legitimate.
Well, now, how can you say
they're very legitimate? They're very legitimate issues that can be argued as to how the United States ought to most efficaciously put an end to its destructive actions in Vietnam. There are many different alternatives that might be thought about.
Yes, but one way, of course, to put an end to America's necessary intervention is to conclude the war successfully. That's a way,
yeah,
right?
one possible way is by destroying Vietnam, which I think is probably the most likely outcome.
Yeah. Well, now, for instance, one way in which we put an end to the Nazi occupation of France was by destroying Nazi Germany, correct?
Chomsky will thus qualify his argument by adding other details, and by the end of the discussion, his argument will look more like this. Although the additions will be heavily contested by Buckley. In fact, Buckley claims that America was preoccupied for the stability of the region in a disinterested way.
It is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation. We are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world.
Chomsky appears to agree that intentions are important, but simply argues that the intentions of the USA in Vietnam were not benign, as they were not benign in other foreign ventures.
What period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots. It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as you know, with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
That's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes, as a special case, every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
This discussion on intentions leads to the claim by Chomsky that there could theoretically be foreign interferences that are good-willed, but they simply never occur in practice.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual
distinction.
Well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared
distinction.
to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great massive cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another.
While Buckley believes that there are examples of benign interferences conducted by the United States.
But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Or for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all.
So the point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledged that we bailed them out.
Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
Oh, I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all.
Papandreou.
Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was.
I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even.
As Andreas Papandreou.
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
Well, in that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights,
and which gets
us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about Let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
The debate then moves on to discussing types of foreign intervention and whether they are imposed or not.
The Marshall Plan aid has to be distinguished quite sharply from the Truman Doctrine.
Why?
Why? Because the Truman Doctrine was a doctrine of military intervention, and the Marshall Plan was our first attempt at a major aid program.
But you do understand that sometimes a soldier can be as useful as a bushel of wheat, don't you?
Now look, nevertheless, if we're going to be at all clear about the American role, we're certainly going to distinguish between military intervention and economic intervention. They're very different in the way they function. Now, the fact of the matter is that neither was disinterested in your sense, I don't think, but they're very different in the impact that they had. The Truman Doctrine, I think, was a disastrous venture. I think the Marshall Plan was arguable.
Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a farmer.
Because there's a difference between receiving...
And you need agriculture. You need fertilizer, so you apply to me for fertilizer. But just before I get it to you, somebody comes up with a bayonet and is about to make it impossible for you to continue farming. Now, in that particular instance, is there a strategic difference between my giving you the fertilizer and my giving the soldier who routes?
That's not. So you're talking about a dream world. The real world is one, because the real world is one in which the alternatives were coming with a bayonet, which is on an American rifle held by an American-backed Greek soldier, and the alternative to that was giving the kind of aid which was used, in fact, to construct the kind of society in Western Europe that we wanted to see developed there. Now, these are two very different things. It's a very different thing to introduce, to run for the Greek army a counterinsurgency program with military support and many military men involved. That's one kind of thing, one sort of repression imposed on the Greek population through American intervention. One might argue whether it's right or wrong, but that's to be very sharply distinguished.
Why do you say imposed? Why do you say imposed? Is it because your presumption here...
My presumption is that
your presumption here is that the Greeks would like the kind of regime which resulted...
My assumption is that all intervention is imposed by any country.
Buckley is quick to give a counterexample.
Quite generally...
Did we impose on the French when we liberated them from the Nazis? Was that an imposition?
We didn't conquer France. We moved the Germans out of it. Just from an outside invading force.
We invaded
But we didn't conquer it from its own people.
So Chomsky qualifies his statement.
In the case of France, the Pétain Laval government, the Vichy government, was supported by German troops. Had the German, they weren't throughout the country necessarily, because there was certainly indigenous support, but there's no question that if German military force had been withdrawn to the other side of the Rhine, then there would have been an overthrow of the Vichy government, and France would have had some different form of government. Now, in that case, our invasion of France was, whether one likes it or not, was in reaction to an occupying external force. It's just pure confusion to identify that with the case of Greece, when we were trying to liberate, we were trying to select the kind of society that Greece would have, and we were trying to save the rulers that we had designated as appropriate from their own population.
To conclude, regarding Chomsky's argument against the Vietnamese War, Buckley will also question the fact that the situation in Vietnam was improving.
And you see, it's very important to recognize, if you want to understand what communism means in Southeast Asia, to realize that along with many authoritarian and repressive practices, which I certainly don't condone, there is on the side a great deal of democratization. There's been a liberation of energies and involvement.
Utter nonsense, if I may say so.
I don't think you're right.
After all, the great paradigm of Red China, in which the AFL-CIO itself concedes to something in the neighborhood of 20 million victims on that particular group. I'm talking according to them.
In return, Chomsky will question Buckley's sources, and in the end, both debaters are far from any kind of agreement.
No one has claimed the million people killed through Chinese communist purges. Absolutely no one.
Well,
no one serious, at least.
It was published in the New Leader.
Fine.
Which
well, the New Leader, yes, of course, the New Leader might. I mean, but I'm talking about
CIA plant.
Well, I said no one serious has. Take a look at the China Journal. Take a look at China Quarterly.
I consider this
but
serious.
You see, I think you're missing the point, really, and I think it's an important point. See, I think in looking at China, one has to recognize a great deal of repressive practice, a great deal of authoritarianism, and one also has to recognize a great deal of spontaneous democratic structure of a sort which never existed in Asia before, and if you want to know the truth, to some extent doesn't even exist in our society. Now, these things exist side by side.
If you read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, you find out that there's an extraordinary democratic structure even inside concentration camps, but it seems to me that it's almost profane to make this observation.
I think it's profane to make that analogy, because I'm talking about true democracy in which...
I don't think so.
Look, in which people, in which the peasants who live in a village control the institutions of their lives. They control the
If you want to get out, you bump into the Berlin Wall on either side of the...
There's no Berlin Wall in China.
There's the equivalent of a Berlin Wall. There's the sea, and there's starvation, the concentration
No, there's no...
camps.
That's just the point. You see, starvation has been very largely overcome in China.
The many interjections that occurred during the debate left behind some arguments and questions, but even if choppy, the debate was quite civil. The substance was mostly concentrated around the realities of foreign intervention, rather than full arguments. Still, arguing facts is important, especially if they are not common knowledge, so that listeners may become acquainted with them, and a good amount was discussed.